Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Your support is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. I never thought the glitz and glamour of Hollywood could be tainted by something so dark, so terrifying. My name is not important. What matters is what I experienced, what still haunts me to this day. I've lived in Los Angeles for years, navigating the ups and downs of fame, but nothing prepared me for the nightmare that unfolded in my own home in the Hollywood Hills. It all began when I moved into a beautiful mid-century modern house overlooking the city. It was a dream come true, a symbol of my success. The house had belonged to a famous director, a man known for creating some of the most iconic horror films in history. The realtor had mentioned this with a smile, as if it were a fun fact to add to the property's charm. But I didn't think much of it at the time. I was more concerned with the stunning views and the privacy the place offered. The first few months were uneventful. I was busy with work, attending red carpet events, and filming on set. The house was my sanctuary, a place to escape from the relentless spotlight. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first, just a feeling like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I brushed it off as paranoia, the result of too much stress and not enough sleep. But the unease grew. I began hearing strange noises at night, soft footsteps, the creak of floorboards, doors opening and closing on their own. I told myself it was the house settling, that old buildings made noises, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was closing in on me. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I always closed it before going to bed, so this was unsettling. I got up, heart pounding, and walked down the hallway, checking each room. Everything was as it should be, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I returned to bed, but sleep eluded me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, until the first light of dawn filtered through the windows. The incidents became more frequent. Objects would move on their own, nothing dramatic, just small things, like a book shifting on the shelf or a chair slightly out of place. I started finding lights turned on that I was sure I had turned off. My phone would randomly play voicemails from an unknown number, but when I listened, all I heard was static. It was unnerving, but I didn't want to admit that something was seriously wrong. After all, what would people think if they knew a well-known actor was scared of ghosts? Then came the night that changed everything. I had just returned from a late-night shoot, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. As I walked into the house, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was freezing, much colder than it should have been for a summer night in Los Angeles. I could see my breath, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I stood in the floor, trying to shake off the feeling, but it only grew stronger. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard the loud crash from the living room. I ran to see what had happened, and there, in the middle of the room, was a shattered mirror. The mirror had been securely mounted on the wall, and there was no way it could have fallen on its own. As I stared at the broken glass, I noticed something strange. My reflection was still in the mirror, even though it was in pieces. I blinked, convinced I was imagining things, but when I looked again, my reflection was gone. I was frozen with fear, unable to move when I heard the faint sound of music. It was coming from the old record player in the corner, the one I had never used. The needle was down, and the record was spinning, but the music was distorted, warped, as if it were playing backward. I tried to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The music grew louder, more chaotic, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet I could still feel the hand, the icy grip tightening. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. And then I saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed. Rooted to the spot, the figure began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, and with each step, the temperature dropped further. I could hear whispers, low and menacing, but I couldn't make out the words. The figure reached out, and just as it was about to touch me, the lights went out. I was plunged into darkness, and the music stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone, and the record player was silent. The room was exactly as it had been, except for the shattered mirror on the floor. I knew then that I couldn't stay in the house any longer. Whatever was there, it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I packed a bag and left at night, not caring where I went as long as it was far away from that cursed house. I later learned that the director, who had lived there before me, had experienced similar things. He had become obsessed with the paranormal, convinced that the spirits of the dead had followed him home from his film sets. He had tried to contact them to understand what they wanted, but it had driven him mad. He died under mysterious circumstances, and the house had remained empty until I bought it. I never went back to that house. I sold it as quickly as I could, not caring about the loss. I just wanted to be rid of it, to forget the horrors I had faced. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me, that the shadows I see in the corners of my vision aren't just tricks of the light. I've tried to move on, to focus on my career, but the memories linger, a constant reminder that some things are beyond our understanding, and that fame and fortune can't protect us from the darkness that lurks in the world and within ourselves. The first time I stepped foot in Greenbrier School, I felt an unsettling chill sweep over me. I was excited, of course. It was my first year as a teacher, and I couldn't wait to shape young minds. I had heard stories about the place from my colleagues, whispers of strange occurrences that seemed to echo through the hallowed halls, but I brushed them off as mere superstition. That first day, however, something was off. The walls were adorned with fading photos of past classes, the smiles of children frozen in time. As I walked down the narrow corridor to my classroom, the air felt thick, as if the school itself was holding its breath. The classrooms were dimly lit, and my room, numbered 204, had a peculiar atmosphere. The windows were clouded, and the once vibrant paint was peeling. I set up my desk, arranging my books and supplies, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. When my students arrived, a mix of eager faces and shy smiles filled the room, but even their energy couldn't dispel the lingering unease. As I began my lesson, I noticed a girl in the back corner who never spoke. Her name was Emily, and she had an unusual intensity about her. The other kids seemed to avoid her, and I often caught her staring out the window, her gaze distant, as if she were seeing something. ICOULD and single quotes T. Days turned into weeks, and as the fall settled in, I couldn't ignore the peculiar happenings any longer. It started small items disappearing from my desk only to reappear days later in odd places. One morning, as I was preparing for class, I heard whispers echoing down the hallway. The voices were soft, almost melodic, But when I stepped out to investigate, the corridor was empty. I brushed it off as my imagination, but my heart raced nonetheless. One afternoon, as the school was closing and the students were being picked up, I decided to stay behind and grade papers. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. As I sat in silence, a whisper's return, clearer this time. I stood up, peering out into the empty hallway, but again, nothing. I turned back to my desk, my heart thumping in my chest. Suddenly, a loud bang reverberated through the classroom. I jumped, my papers flying everywhere. My first thought was that a student had returned, but when I checked, the room was empty. That night, I decided to do some research about the school's history. I dug through old archives, learning that Greenbrier had been built in the early 1900s. It had a long and storied past, with a few tragic incidents marring its reputation. The most chilling story was about a girl named Lily who had attended the school decades ago. She had gone missing one stormy night, and, despite extensive searches, she was never found. The townspeople said her spirit lingered, searching for her lost home. The next day I approached Emily after class. There was something about her that intrigued me. "You seem to know a lot about this school," I said, trying to draw her out. She looked at me, her eyes piercing. "I know what happened to Lily." I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "She's still here. She wants to be found." The room felt colder, and I shivered despite the warm afternoon sun filtering through the window. "What do you mean? How do you know this?" Emily shrugged, looking down at her hands. "I just do. She talks to me sometimes." "Talks to you?" "Yeah. She's lonely." I didn't know how to respond, but I felt a strange mix of curiosity and fear. That night I returned home and couldn't shake Emily's words from my mind. The next day I decided to confront the whispers once and for all. I stayed late, waiting for the last student to leave. When the hallway was finally empty, I took a deep breath and called out, "Is anyone there?" Silence enveloped me, but then I heard it again, the faint whispers. I followed the sound, my heart racing as I ventured deeper into the building. I reached the old gymnasium, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a draft brush past me. "Lily?" I called out, my voice trembling. Suddenly a shadow darted across the room. I turned, but there was nothing there. My instincts told me to leave, but I felt an inexplicable pull to stay. "Lily, if you're here, please show yourself," I pleaded. The air grew thick, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, a small figure standing at the far end of the gym. She wore an old-fashioned dress, her hair cascading in waves around her shoulders. I could barely breathe as she turned to face me. Her eyes were deep pools of sorrow. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing around me. "Help you how?" I stammered. "I want to go home." "I don't belong here," panic coursed through me. "But how can I help you?" She pointed towards a section of the gym, her eyes filled with an indescribable longing. "You have to find me." I knew I needed to act, to uncover the truth behind Lily's disappearance. The next day I gathered my students, and during art class I asked them to draw their favorite place in the school. Emily immediately began sketching the gymnasium, her brow furrowed in concentration. When the bell rang, I approached her. "Emily, what are you drawing?" She looked up, her expression unreadable. "The place where she is." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Where is that?" Emily pointed to a spot on the paper, in the walls. "There's a secret room." I decided to investigate further. That evening, armed with a flashlight and determination, I returned to the gym. I started examining the walls. looking for anything that seemed out of place. After a few minutes, I noticed a section of the wall that appeared slightly different from the rest. My heart raced as I pressed against it, feeling a give that shouldn't have been there. With a little force, I managed to pry open a hidden door, revealing a narrow passageway that led into darkness. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed forward, the memory of Lily's pleading face driving me onward. The passage was damp and musty, the air heavy with the scent of mold. I felt my way along the wall until I reached a small room dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. In the center of the room was an old wooden trunk. My hands trembled as I approached it. I opened the trunk to find dusty clothes, old toys, and a diary. I flipped through the pages, my breath catching as I read about Lily's life at the school, her hopes, her dreams, and her despair when she vanished. As I read the final entry, a sense of understanding washed over me. Lily hadn't just gone missing. She had been trapped here, her spirit unable to move on because her story had been left unfinished. I gathered everything up and hurried back to the gym, determined to tell my students about Lily, to let them know that she was real and she deserved to be remembered. The next day I brought the diary to class, sharing Lily's story with them. The students listened in rapt attention, and when I finished, I could see the realization dawning on their faces. Emily was the first to speak. "We need to have a memorial for her," she suggested, her voice firm. The other kids nodded in agreement. We decided to organize a small ceremony to honor Lily, to acknowledge her existence, and give her the closure she needed. That Friday, we gathered in the gym, decorated it with flowers, and shared our thoughts about the little girl who had once walked those halls. As we lit a candle in her memory, I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. The whispers that had haunted me began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace. In that moment, I knew we had finally given Lily a voice, a way to be remembered. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere in the school transformed. The unease that had clung to the walls began to dissipate, replaced by laughter and the vibrant energy of children learning. Emily blossomed in her newfound role, no longer the outcast, but a central part of our classroom community. One afternoon, as I was leaving, I noticed a beautiful butterfly flitting around the playground. It landed gently on my shoulder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a sign, a symbol of Lily's spirit finally being free. I never experienced the whispers again after that day, and the haunting feeling that had once enveloped Greenbrier School lifted like fog in the morning sun. Lily had found her peace, and in doing so, she had brought a group of children together, teaching us all a valuable lesson about compassion and remembrance. The school had always been a place of learning, but now it felt like a home, a safe haven for every spirit, both living and lost. The sky was a deep, brooding shade of gray as I drove up the winding road to Pine Hill. My old truck groaned with each turn, the forest on either side thick and silent. I was heading to a small cabin I'd recently inherited from my late uncle. The place had been in our family for generations, but it had stood abandoned for years, ever since my uncle's sudden disappearance. People in the nearby town still whispered about him, though I never put much stock in their talk. He was an odd man, sure, but the idea that the woods had taken him, that something was lurking out there, seemed ridiculous. At least, that's what I told myself as I approached the cabin. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered it from my childhood, a small, weathered structure with a sagging porch and a roof that had seen better days. I parked the truck and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound in the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and a heavy fog clung to the trees. As I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the musty scent of old wood and dust greeted me. The interior was dim, with the fading light of the day struggling to penetrate the grime-covered windows. I spent the first few hours cleaning up, trying to make the place livable. I'd brought a few supplies with me, canned food, some tools, and a flashlight. I had no intention of staying long, just enough to assess what needed fixing before putting the place on the market. As night fell, the woods outside grew darker, the shadows deepening until it felt like the cabin was floating in a sea of black. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, the crackling flames casting flickering light across the room. I settled into an old armchair with a book, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting to the stories I had heard about the hill, about people going missing, never to be seen again. The locals spoke of an unseen watcher, something that moved silently among the trees, waiting for those foolish enough to wander too far. The sound came again, a little louder this time, closer. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but then the sound changed. It was no longer a rustling, but a slow, deliberate scraping, as if something or someone was dragging something heavy through the dirt. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up, the book slipping from my hands. I grabbed the flashlight and headed to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtain. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing, just the dense line of trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I scanned the area, but everything was still. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I returned to the chair, but sleep was elusive. The sound echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing minute. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the normal noises of the forest, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I felt it in my bones, a primal instinct that told me to leave, to get out while I still could. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed up, staring into the dying embers of the fire, the silence around me becoming oppressive. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. I shot up from the chair, my heart racing as I looked around the room. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was pitch black. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light flickered, barely illuminating the room. I slowly made my way to the door, my ears straining to catch any sound. The bang had come from outside, I was sure of it. But now there was nothing, just the deafening silence of the woods. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it. But I had to know. I had to see what was out there. I turned the knob and pulled the door open, the creaking hinges sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air biting at my skin. The fog had thickened, wrapping around the trees like a shroud. I shined the flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the mist, revealing nothing. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, closer. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was coming from the direction of the old well at the edge of the property. I steeled myself and began walking towards the sound, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The beam of light wavered as I approached the well, the sound growing louder with each step. I reached the edge of the well and peered over, shining the light down into the dark abyss. For a moment I saw nothing, just the empty blackness that seemed to go on forever. But then something moved, a shadow shifting deep within the well. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. The shadow moved again, rising slowly, deliberately, until it was just below the surface. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away as the figure began to emerge from the well. It was tall, impossibly so, its form indistinct, like smoke or mist. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure stepped out of the well, its movements slow and deliberate. It had no face, no features, just a dark, amorphous mass that seemed to suck the light from the air around it. It stood there, silent, watching me with an intensity that I could feel in my bones. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was paralyzed. Trapped in its gaze, the figure began to move towards me, its steps slow and measured. I took a step back, then another, my feet moving on their own as my mind raced. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled back to the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it and shoving a chair under the handle for good measure. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I could hear it outside, the soft scrape of its feet on the gravel, the creak of the porch as it approached. It was toying with me, drawing out the terror, savoring it. The door rattled on its hinges as the thing outside tested the handle, the sound sending a fresh wave of fear through me. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape. I looked around the room, my mind racing as I tried to come up with a plan. The truck was my only option. If I could make it to the truck, I might have a chance. I grabbed the keys from the table and ran to the back door. I unlocked it, throwing it open and sprinting for the truck. I could hear it behind me, the soft scrape of its feet on the ground, the sound growing louder with each passing second. I reached the truck, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I finally managed to unlock it and threw the door open. Jumping inside and slamming it shut behind me, I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, the tires spinning on the gravel as I sped away from the cabin. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I drove as fast as I could down the winding road, the dark trees flashing by on either side. I didn't stop until I reached the town, my hands still shaking as I parked the truck in front of the only motel in the area. I stumbled out of the truck, my legs barely supporting me as I made my way inside. The clerk looked up as I entered, his expression changing to one of concern as he took in my disheveled appearance. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with worrying. I shook my head, unable to form the words. I just needed a room, somewhere to hide, to try and make sense of what had happened. The clerk handed me a key, and I made my way to the room, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto the bed. I didn't sleep that night, my mind replaying the events over and over again. The figure in the well, the way it had watched me, followed me. I knew I couldn't go back to the cabin, couldn't face whatever it was that had emerged from the darkness, but I also knew that it wasn't over. The figure was still out there, watching, waiting. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. The next morning, I packed my things and left the town, vowing never to return. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the unseen presence from Pine Hill was still with me, and as the miles stretched on, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that dark, faceless figure standing at the side of the road, watching me with eyes that weren't there, waiting for the moment when it would come for me again. I've been a truck driver for over 15 years. It's a tough job, but it pays the bills, and there's something about the open road that I've always loved. The freedom, the solitude, the sense of adventurous like nothing else. But sometimes the road isn't as empty as it seems. Sometimes it's not the miles that wear you down, but the things you can't explain, the things that shouldn't be there. My name is Tom, And this is the story of the night I encountered something on Highway 22 that changed the way I look at the world forever. It was a cold December night in 2019, and I was hauling a load of steel beams from Wichita to Denver. The weather had been bad all day, with snow flurries and gusting winds making the drive slow and treacherous. By the time I reached the stretch of Highway 22 that cuts through the remote plains of western Kansas, it was nearly midnight, and the snow was coming down hard. I knew I should probably pull over and wait out the storm, but I was behind schedule and eager to make up lost time. The road was empty, just a long ribbon of asphalt cutting through a white landscape, with nothing but the occasional farmhouse or barn breaking up the monotony. The snow muffled everything, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. I was tired, my eyes heavy, but I pushed on, knowing I still had a few hours to go before I could stop for the night. As I rounded a curve, I saw something up ahead, a dark shape standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, squinting through the snow, trying to make out what it was. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a cow that had wandered onto the highway. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person standing perfectly still in the middle of the lane. I hit the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the icy road as I came to a stop just a few feet from the figure. My heart was pounding, a mix of fear and confusion flooding my mind. What the hell was someone doing out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a snowstorm? I turned on the high beams illuminating the figure in the road. It was a woman, dressed in a long, dark coat, her hair hanging in wet strands around her face. She didn't move, didn't seem to notice the truck bearing down on her, just stood there, staring straight ahead. I rolled down the window, the cold air biting at my skin, and called out to her, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" But she didn't respond. She didn't even look at me, just kept staring into the distance, as if I wasn't even there. I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. Something about her wasn't right. I thought maybe she was in shock or had been in an accident. So I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab, stepping into the knee-deep snow. The wind whipped at my face, and the snow stung my eyes as I approached her. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need a ride?" I asked again, but still she didn't answer. I was just a few feet away from her now, close enough to see her face clearly in the light of the truck's headlights. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark, hollow, like they were staring right through me. I reached out to touch her shoulder, to try and snap her out of whatever trance she was in, but the moment my hand touched her coat, she vanished. 1 second she was there, solid and real, and the next she was gone, like she had ever been there at all. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the ice, my heart racing. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. I looked around, frantically searching the road and the surrounding fields, but there was no sign of her, just the empty highway stretching out into the darkness. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I so tired that I had hallucinated the whole thing? But then I saw them footprints in the snow, leading from the side of the road to the spot where she had been standing. They were clear, unmistakable, and they ended right where I had touched her. There were no other tracks, no sign of where she had gone or how she had disappeared. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cold seeping into my bones, trying to wrap my head around what I had just witnessed. Finally, I forced myself to move, to get back into the truck and drive away from that place as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop on the outskirts of Denver, hours later, still shaken by what I had seen. I kept replaying the event in my mind over and over, trying to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, a figment of my tired brain. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew I had seen something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist. In the days that followed, I did some research, trying to find any information about that stretch of highway, hoping to find a rational explanation for what I had experienced. What I found only made the whole thing more unsettling. Highway 20 had a history, a dark one. There were stories, rumors, about a woman who had been killed on that road years ago, a hit-and-run that had never been solved. Drivers had reported seeing her standing in the middle of the highway, always in the same spot, always on stormy nights, and always disappearing before anyone could reach her. I wasn't the first to see her, and I doubt I'll be the last, but I'm done with that road. I'll take the long way around, go miles out of my way if I have to, but I won't drive that stretch of Highway 22 again. Some things are best left alone, some roads best left untraveled, and some ghosts best left to haunt the places they died. I had always heard whispers about Blackwood Factory. It was an old industrial site on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades, but never truly forgotten. The stories surrounding it were enough to keep most people away. Strange noises, unexplained disappearances, and a general sense of dread that seemed to hang over the place like a heavy fog. I didn't put much stock in those tales, but when the opportunity came up to investigate the factory for a local documentary, I couldn't resist. I thought it would be a great way to get some footage for my project and maybe debunk a few myths along the way. The day I arrived, the factory looked every bit the part of a place that time had forgotten. The building was massive, its once proud facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The windows were shattered, and the front gate was hanging off its hinges. It was an imposing sight, but I was determined to go in and explore. I parked my car outside and grabbed my camera gear, the weight of the equipment feeling like a comforting burden as I walked towards the entrance. As I approached, the sky grew darker, clouds rolling in ominously. I pushed open the creaky front door and stepped inside, the air immediately growing colder. The factory was even more massive on the inside, with high ceilings and a labyrinth of corridors. My footsteps echoed off the metal walls, and the only sound was the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. I set up my camera and began recording, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The deeper I ventured into the factory, the more I felt an unsettling presence. It was as if the building itself was watching me, its silence heavy with the weight of forgotten memories. I tried to focus on the task at hand, capturing footage of the decaying machinery and the remnants of a bygone era. But the further I went, the more the sense of unease grew. It was hard to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that there was something or someone else in the factory with me. I reached a large, open room that seemed to have been some sort of assembly area. Broken conveyor belts lay abandoned, and old workstations were covered in dust. As I filmed, I noticed something odd on the floor, what looked like fresh tracks in the dust, leading from one of the side rooms. I followed the tracks, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The side room was dark, the light barely penetrating the gloom. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was cluttered with old equipment and machinery, but what caught my eye was a large metal door at the far end. It was slightly ajar, and the tracks led straight to it. I approached cautiously, my heart racing with anticipation. I pushed the door open and stepped into a narrow corridor. The air was colder here, and the silence was even more pronounced. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, winding and turning as if it was designed to confuse anyone who ventured inside. I followed it, my flashlight flickering and the beam casting eerie patterns on the walls. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was an old control panel, its buttons and levers coated in dust. I approached it, curiosity getting the better of me. As I examined the panel, I noticed a faint humming sound, almost imperceptible, but definitely present. I reached out to touch one of the levers when I felt a sudden chill. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the air was thick with an almost palpable sense of dread. I scanned the room, trying to find the source of the cold, but there was nothing, just the old machinery and the darkness. I turned back to the control panel, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe there was some explanation for the humming sound, some old machinery that had been inadvertently powered up. I started to investigate the panel, my fingers brushing against the controls. The humming grew louder, and the temperature continued to drop. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The humming had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. I clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the beam of light, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room. It was tall and indistinct, its form blending into the darkness. My heart pounded as I tried to make out any details, but the figure remained just out of reach of the light. I could feel its gaze on me, a suffocating presence that seemed to fill the room. I backed away slowly, my flashlight shaking as I tried to keep the figure in view. The shadow followed me, its movements unnaturally smooth and deliberate. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I had to get out, had to escape whatever it was that was pursuing me. I raced through the maze-like corridors, my flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The factory seemed to shift and change around me, the walls and passages twisting in ways that defied logic. I could hear the shadowy figure behind me, its presence a constant, oppressive force that seemed to close in with every step. I reached the main room, my heart pounding in my chest as I burst through the door. I glanced back and saw the figure standing at the entrance to the corridor, its form solidifying into something more distinct. It was a dark, formless shape, but its eyes, if they could be called that, were fixed on me, glowing with an unsettling light. I didn't stop to look again. I ran to the exit, my flashlight flickering as I stumbled over debris. I reached the front door and pushed it open, the cool night air hitting me with a welcome relief. I didn't look back as I sprinted to my car. Throwing open the door and jumping inside, I started the engine and sped away from the factory, the dark building shrinking in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was far out of town, my hand still shaking on the steering wheel. The factory was a place I would never return to. A place that had shown me a glimpse of something I couldn't understand, but knew was dangerous. As I drove, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see the shadowy figure following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out before me. I knew the factory was still out there, waiting, and I knew that whatever I had encountered was not something that could be easily explained or understood. It was a reminder that some places are best left alone, their secrets better left buried in the darkness. I've worked as a park ranger for the better part of 2 decades, patrolling the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park in Montana. The job has its ups and downs, but I've always loved the quiet beauty of the mountains, the crisp air, and the sense of peace that comes from being surrounded by nature. However, the peace I once found in the park was shattered one fateful night, a night I'll never forget. It was my last shift before retirement. I'd been looking forward to it for months, one final patrol, and then I'd be done. I'd be free to spend my days fishing, hiking for fun instead of work, and spending time with my family. The park had been my second home for so long, and I knew every trail, every stream, every hidden nook and cranny, or so I thought. The night was clear, the stars shining brightly overhead as I drove the winding mountain roads in my Ranger vehicle. It was late, probably around midnight, and the park was quiet, with most visitors either tucked away in their campsites or long gone. My radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Ranger Scott, this is base. We've got a report of strange lights up near the old fire tower on Long Pine Ridge. You want to check it out?" I sigh, rubbing my tired eyes. The fire tower hadn't been in use for years, abandoned after a newer one was built closer to the main campground. But people still hiked up there occasionally, drawn by the panoramic views of the park. "Copy that, base. I'm on my way," I reply, my voice steady despite the weariness I felt. It was probably just some kids messing around, trying to scare themselves, but it was my job to check it out, and I wasn't going to leave it for someone else on my last night. The drive up to Long Pine Ridge was rough, the narrow dirt road winding through dense forest, the trees closed in around me, their branches casting eerie shadows in the headlights. The further I went, the more isolated I felt, as if the forest itself was pressing in on me. Finally, I reached the trailhead that led up to the fire tower. I parked the vehicle and grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I started up the trail. It was steep, and the climb was tougher than I remembered. My breath puffed out in clouds as I trudged upward, the silence of the forest broken only by the crunch of my boots on the gravel. As I neared the top, I noticed a faint glow coming from the direction of the tower. It wasn't the harsh light of a flashlight or a campfire, but a soft bluish light that seemed to pulse gently. I quickened my pace, my heart thudding in my chest. The trail leveled out as I reached the summit, and there it was, the old fire tower, silhouetted against the starry sky. The light was coming from inside the tower, flickering and shifting like something alive. I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "Hello, this is Ranger Scott. Is anyone up there?" No response. I felt a knot of unease tighten in my stomach as I approached the base of the tower. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I climbed up to the observation platform. The light grew brighter as I ascended, bathing the interior of the tower in an otherworldly glow. I reached the top and paused, taking in the sight before me. The room was empty, but the light seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, emanating from the very walls of the tower. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, and for a moment I just stood there, staring in awe. Then, without warning, the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard a voice whispering my name. "Scott, ... It was soft, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the corners of the room, but there was no one there, just the empty tower and that strange, pulsing light. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The whisper came again, closer this time, as if it was right next to me. "Scott, you shouldn't have come ... double quotes. Panic surged through me, and I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste to get out of that tower. The light followed me, growing brighter and more intense, until it felt like it was burning into my back. I hit the ground running, not stopping until I was back at my vehicle. I jumped in, slammed the door, and floored the gas pedal, not looking back as I sped down the mountain. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady, my mind racing with what had just happened. I didn't stop until I was back at the ranger station, where I sat in the parking lot for what felt like hours, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I'd heard the stories, the legends that the old fire tower was haunted, that something happened there long ago, something terrible. Rangers had reported strange occurrences over the years, lights, voices, cold spots, but I'd always dismissed them as tall tales, the kind of stories people tell to scare newcomers. But now I knew better. Whatever was up there, it was real, and it didn't want to be disturbed. I never told anyone about what happened that night. I finished my shift, handed in my badge, and walked away from the job I'd loved for so many years. But the memory of that night still haunts me, a constant reminder that there are things in this world we can't explain, things better left alone. I haven't been back to Glacier National Park since. I've tried to put it behind me, to move on with my life, but some nights when the wind howls through the trees and the darkness presses in, I swear I can still hear that voice, whispering my name. The Ravenswood Asylum had been abandoned for over 20 years, yet the tales of its dark history seemed to cling to its crumbling walls. The asylum had once been a place of both hope and horror, a sanctuary for those struggling with mental illness and a site of unspeakable suffering. It had closed its doors after a series of unexplained events and mysterious disappearances, leaving only whispers and rumors in its wake. When the opportunity arose to investigate the asylum for a local news segment, I jumped at the chance. I was a journalist with a reputation for chasing down the most elusive stories, and Ravenswood promised to be a compelling one. I arrived early in the morning, the sun casting an eerie glow over the derelict building. The asylum loomed ahead, its once grand facade now marred by decay and neglect. I parked my car and approached the entrance, the heavy metal door hanging crookedly on its hinges. The air was thick with the scent of damp and decay as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The floor was vast, with high ceilings and dusty remnants of furniture scattered about. It was as if the asylum had been frozen in time, the echoes of its past still resonating through the empty halls. My camera equipment was set up, and I began my exploration. The asylum was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I could feel the weight of the place, a palpable sense of foreboding that seemed to seep from the very walls. As I wandered through the asylum, I encountered rooms that were once patient wards, their beds now empty and covered in dust. The walls were adorned with faded, peeling paint and the occasional blood stain, remnants of the asylum's troubled history. I documented everything, my camera capturing the stark reality of the place. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. In one of the corridors I saw what appeared to be fresh footprints in the dust, leading towards a locked door. I knew I hadn't seen these tracks before, and they didn't match my own. My curiosity was piqued, and I decided to investigate further. I found a maintenance room with an old keychain hanging from a peg. After some searching, I discovered that one of the keys fit the locked door. With a deep breath, I unlocked it and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a small, dimly lit space, filled with old medical equipment and rusted tools. In the corner of the room was a large wooden chest. The chest was old and battered, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight casting long shadows across the room. I opened the chest, revealing a collection of old documents, photographs, and personal belongings. Among them were patient files, each one detailing the struggles and treatments of individuals who had once been patients at Ravenswood. I was engrossed in the documents when I heard a noise behind me, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I turned, shining my flashlight around the room, but there was no one there. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me and continued to sift through the papers. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear faint, mournful cries echoing through the corridors. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pressed on, hoping to find something that would explain the strange occurrences. As I flipped through the papers, I came across a photograph of a group of patients. Their faces were gaunt and haunted, and in the background I could make out a figure that didn't belong, a dark shape that seemed to watch from the shadows. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom as I tried to find the source of the disturbance. The whispers had become a cacophony of voices, each one overlapping and merging into an unsettling chorus. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. I turned, but there was no one there, just the empty room and the eerie silence. I felt a presence, something intangible yet overwhelmingly real, moving through the space. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. In the pitch black, I could feel the temperature drop, a cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I could hear the whispers clearly now, each voice filled with pain and desperation. I backed away, my heart racing as I stumbled over the debris on the floor. I needed to get out, to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to suffocate me. I rushed through the asylum, my flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The whispers grew louder, following me as I fled through the labyrinth of corridors. The walls seemed to close in, and the darkness felt almost tangible, pressing in on me from all sides. As I reached the floor, I saw a figure standing in the doorway, its form shadowy and indistinct. I couldn't make out any details, but it was clear that the figure was watching me, its presence a source of overwhelming dread. I didn't stop to investigate. I bolted past the figure and out of the asylum. Slamming the door behind me, I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I jumped inside and started the engine, speeding away from Ravenswood Asylum. As I drove away, I glanced back at the building, its silhouette receding into the distance. I knew that whatever I had encountered at Ravenswood was something beyond explanation, a haunting presence that defied understanding. To this day, I can't explain the whispers or the shadowy figure that followed me through the asylum. All I know is that Ravenswood Asylum holds a darkness that should remain undisturbed. Its echoes a reminder of the suffering and despair that once pervaded its halls. For as long as I can remember, the open road has been my life. There's something about the freedom, the solitude, and the miles stretching endlessly ahead that has always called to me. I've driven across the country more times than I can count, delivering cargo from coast to coast, seeing parts of America that most people only read about. But there's one stretch of highway that I try to avoid at all costs, Route 89, a desolate road that cuts through the Arizona desert. It's known among truckers as a haunted highway, and after what I experienced one dark, lonely night, I'll never doubt those stories again. It was early November, the air crisp and cold, as I headed out of Flagstaff with a load of machinery bound for Phoenix. I had a tight schedule and plan to drive straight through the night. The desert at night can be beautiful in a stark, otherworldly way, but it can also be eerie, an endless expanse of darkness broken only by the occasional headlights of another vehicle or the distant glow of a small town. That night, though, I was completely alone. The highway was empty, stretching out in front of me like a ribbon of black asphalt. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the steady thrum of the tires on the road. I'd been driving for hours when I first noticed the fog. It started as a thin mist, barely noticeable, but it quickly thickened until it was like driving through a wall of cotton. My headlights barely penetrated the gloom, and I had to slow down to a crawl just to see the road ahead. I'd driven through fog before, but this was different, denser, darker, as if it wasn't just fog, but something more, something alive. As the fog closed in around me, I felt a sudden chill, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I turned up the heat in the cab, but it did little to ward off the cold that seemed to seep into my bones. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, barely visible through the fog. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the truck skidded to a stop just inches from the figure. My heart was pounding as I leaned forward, peering through the windshield to get a better look. It was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing white dress that billowed around her like it was made of smoke. Her hair was dark and tangled, hanging in limp strands over her face. She didn't move, didn't even seem to notice the massive truck that had nearly run her down. I honked the horn, but she didn't react. Just stood there, staring at something I couldn't see, her eyes empty and hollow. A sense of dread washed over me, stronger than anything I'd ever felt before. Something was wrong, deeply, horribly wrong. I rolled down the window and called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" No response. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the low rumble of the truck's engine. I didn't know what to do, get out and try to help her, or drive around her and get the hell out of there. Every instinct told me to leave, but something held me in place, some strange compulsion to stay and see what she would do. And then she moved, slowly, almost imperceptibly. She turned her head to look directly at me. Her eyes were dark, so dark they seemed to swallow the light. There was no emotion in them, no life, just an endless void that seemed to pull me in. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. She took a step toward the truck, her movements slow and deliberate. Shroud. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was frozen, trapped by the cold, dark stare of the woman in white. She took another step, then another, until she was standing right next to the cab, her face inches from the window. Her eyes bore into mine, and I felt a wave of terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if she was looking into my soul, seeing every fear, every regret, every dark secret I had ever buried. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it echoed in my mind like a scream. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her breath fogging up the glass. "This is not your place." I couldn't respond, couldn't move, couldn't even think. My mind was blank, consumed by the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the cab. She reached out, her hand pressing against the glass, and I could see that it wasn't a hand at all, but something twisted, something not human. Her fingers were long and bony, the skin stretched tight over the knuckles, the nails black and sharp. I finally broke free of the paralysis that held me, slamming my foot down on the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, the tires spinning on the slick asphalt before finally gaining traction. I didn't look back, didn't check the mirrors, just drove as fast as I could through the fog, desperate to put as much distance between me and whatever that thing was. The fog began to thin out as I drove, the darkness giving way to the faint light of dawn. My hands were still shaking, my heart racing, but I didn't stop until I reached the outskirts of Phoenix, pulling into a truck stop and parking in the first available spot. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that woman, of those dark, empty eyes staring into mine. I've heard the stories about Route 89, the tales of ghostly apparitions, strange lights, and unexplained disappearances. I always thought they were just that, stories, tall tales told by truckers to pass the time. But now I know better. Something is out there on that highway, something that shouldn't be. I haven't driven that route since, and I avoid night runs whenever I can. The open road isn't the same for me anymore, the freedom and solitude tainted by the memory of that night. I still drive, still make my living hauling cargo across the country, but I'm always on edge, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for that fog to roll in and for those dark, empty eyes to appear in my rearview mirror. It was supposed to be the masterpiece that would define my career, a painting so powerful, so moving, that it would cement my place in the art world forever. I had spent years honing my craft, struggling through obscurity and rejection, until finally my work started to gain some recognition. Galleries were beginning to take notice. Collectors were starting to buy, and for the first time in my life I felt like I was on the verge of something great. That's when I found the painting the one that would change everything. I was browsing a small, out-of-the-way antique shop looking for inspiration. The place was cluttered with all sorts of oddities, old furniture, faded photographs, rusty tools, and more trinkets than you could count. The kind of place where you could spend hours rummaging through the past. I wasn't expecting to find anything of real value, just something that might spark an idea. But then I saw it, tucked away in a dusty corner, leaning against a stack of old frames. It was a painting about 2 feet by 3, in an ornate, gilded frame that had seen better days. The canvas was cracked and yellowed with age, but the image itself was still vibrant, almost unsettlingly so. It depicted a scene of a forest at dusk, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. In the center of the painting was a figure, a man or woman, I couldn't tell which, draped in a dark cloak, standing with their back to the viewer. There was something about the way the figure was painted, something that drew me in, that made me feel like I had to have it. I asked the shop owner about it, but he didn't know much. Said it had been there as long as he could remember, and he was happy to let it go for a bargain price just to get rid of it. I didn't hesitate. I bought it on the spot and took it back to my studio. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I hung it on the wall, thinking I'd study it for a while, see if it inspired anything. But as the days went by, I found myself staring at it more and more, unable to look away. There was something in the painting, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, something that seemed to shift and change the longer I looked at it. I became obsessed. I stopped working on my own paintings, spending hours in front of that old canvas, trying to figure out what it was about the image that held me captive. I started having strange dreams, dark, twisted visions of the forest in the painting, of being lost among the trees, chased by something I could never see but always felt just behind me. The figure in the painting began to haunt me, appearing in my dreams, always just out of reach, always with its back turned, refusing to reveal its face. I knew I was losing my grip, but I couldn't stop. I started painting again, but the work was different now, darker, more chaotic. I couldn't paint anything without that figure creeping in, that twisted forest appearing in the background. My friends noticed the change. They said I seemed distant, distracted, that my work had taken on a disturbing edge. They were concerned, but I brushed them off, convinced that I was on the verge of a breakthrough, that this was the price of true art. Then the accidents started. Small things at first, a brush slipping from my hand, spilling paint across a canvas, a cut from a palette knife that went a little too deep. But they escalated: broken glass, a fire that nearly destroyed my studio, a car accident that left me with a concussion and a lingering sense of dread. I began to feel like I was being watched, followed by something I couldn't see. I started to notice things around the painting, shadows that shouldn't be there, a chill in the air whenever I got too close. And then one night I saw it. I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I felt that a presence in the room, something heavy, oppressive. I opened my eyes, and there it was, the figure from the painting, standing at the foot of my bed, its back still turned to me, but closer now, so close I could see the details of the cloak, the folds in the fabric, the way it seemed to move as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to speak. As it slowly began to turn, I knew I couldn't let it happen, couldn't let it show me its face. Every instinct screamed at me to look away, to close my eyes, but I couldn't. I was trapped, forced to watch as it turned, inch by inch, revealing more and more of itself. Just as I was about to see its face, something snapped inside me. I don't know where the strength came from, but I lunged forward, grabbing the painting off the wall and hurling it across the room. It hit the floor with a crash, the frame splintering, the canvas tearing down the middle. As soon as it was destroyed, the figure vanished, and I could move again. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, staring at the ruined painting, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the morning, I took what was left of it and burned it, watching the flames consume the canvas, the figure finally disappearing into the smoke and ash. I thought that would be the end of it, that destroying the painting would break whatever hold it had on me. But the dreams haven't stopped. They're worse now, more vivid, more terrifying. The figure still haunts me, still appears in my mind every time I close my eyes. My work has become a reflection of my descent into madness, dark, twisted images that no one wants to buy, that I don't even want to look at once they're finished. I've lost everything: my reputation, my friends, my sanity. I know it's only a matter of time before the figure comes back, before it finally shows me its face. And when it does, I know I won't survive. It was just another graveyard shift, the kind that stretches on forever, leaving you alone with your thoughts and the hum of the engine. The city was quiet at that hour, the streets empty save for the occasional drunk stumbling home or the rare insomniac wandering aimlessly. I'd been driving a taxi for years, long enough to know that the night held its own kind of mysteries. But nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced that night. I was cruising down a deserted street, my eyes half closed from boredom and fatigue, when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, under a flickering street light, one arm raised to flag me down. There was something odd about her, something that didn't register until later, but at the moment, I was just relieved to have a fare. I pulled over, and she climbed in without a word, settling into the back seat. She was pale, almost unnaturally so, with long, dark hair that hung down around her face like a veil. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a long, flowing dress that looked like something out of a different era. But what struck me most were her eyes, dark and empty, as if they were windows into nothingness. I asked her where she wanted to go, and she gave me an address that sent a shiver down my spine. It was on the other side of town, a part of the city I rarely ventured into, a neighborhood that had fallen into decay and disrepair long ago. But a fare was a fare, and I wasn't about to turn down the money, so I nodded and pulled away from the curb. The ride was quiet. Too quiet. I tried to make small talk, asked her how her night was going, but she didn't respond. She just stared out the window, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The silence was oppressive, the kind that makes your skin crawl, and I found myself gripping the wheel a little too tightly, my knuckles white with tension. The closer we got to the address she'd given me, the more uneasy I felt. The streets grew darker, the buildings more dilapidated, until it felt like we were driving into another world, a place where the living had no business being. I could feel my heart start to race, a sense of dread settling over me like a heavy blanket. Finally, we arrived. It was an old, crumbling house, the kind you'd expect to see in a horror movie, with broken windows and a sagging roof. There were no lights, no signs of life, just an overwhelming sense of abandonment and decay. I turned to tell her we were there, but when I looked into the back seat, she was gone. The seat was empty, the door still closed, no sign that anyone had ever been there. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly got out of the car, looking around, calling out to her, but there was no response, no trace of her anywhere. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened, my mind racing with possibilities. Had she slipped out without me noticing? But that didn't make any sense. I would have heard the door, would have seen her leave. The only explanation that made any sense was one I didn't want to consider, that she hadn't been real, that I had just given a ride to a ghost. I got back in the car, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel, and sped away from that place as fast as I could. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with me, that her presence lingered in the car, in the shadows just out of sight. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I couldn't keep driving the same route, couldn't bring myself to go back to that part of town. The memory of that night stayed with me, haunting my thoughts, making me question what was real and what wasn't. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was back in the car, driving down those dark, empty streets, always with the sense that something was following me, something I couldn't escape. It wasn't long before I quit the night shift altogether, opting for the safety of daylight, where the ghosts couldn't reach me. But even in the daylight, I can't escape the feeling that she's still out there, waiting for another ride, another chance to take someone to that place where the living don't belong. I've heard stories from other drivers since then, tales of phantom passengers, of people who get into the back seat and disappear without a trace. I don't know if I believe them or if they're just trying to scare the newbies. But I do know one thing: I'll never drive that route again. And if I ever see a passenger like her, standing under a flickering street light in the dead of night, I'll keep driving. Because some fares aren't worth the fare, and some roads are better left untraveled. The summer of 1997 was supposed to be a time for adventure and fun, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. My friends and I had been planning our camping trip for months, and we finally settled on Hollow Creek Campground, a secluded spot nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The campground was known for its picturesque landscapes and tranquil atmosphere, making it the perfect destination for a group of college friends looking to unwind. Little did we know that our weekend getaway would turn into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. We arrived at Hollow Creek on a Friday afternoon, our cars loaded with camping gear and supplies. The drive had been long and winding, the roads becoming narrower and more treacherous as we ventured deeper into the mountains. By the time we reached the campground, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dense forest that surrounded us. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The campground was nearly empty, with only a few other tents scattered among the trees. We chose a spot near the edge of the forest, close to the creek that gave the campground its name. It was a peaceful spot, with the sound of the babbling creek providing a soothing backdrop. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for what we hoped would be a weekend of laughter and relaxation. As night fell, the forest around us came alive with the sounds of nature. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl filled the air. We sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The mood was light, and for a while it felt like we were the only people in the world. But as the night wore on, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. The forest, once so full of life, now seemed ominously silent. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying in the breeze like ghostly fingers. Around midnight, we heard the first strange noise. It was a low, guttural growl. Coming from deep within the forest, we all fell silent, straining to listen. The growl was followed by a series of strange, unidentifiable sounds: snapping branches, heavy footsteps, and what sounded like faint whispers. My heart began to race as I glanced at my friends, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves that it was just a bear or some other wild animal. But deep down, we knew that something was wrong. As the night grew darker, the strange noises continued, growing louder and more frequent. The once peaceful campground now felt like a place of dread, as if the forest itself was alive with some unseen malevolence. We decided to call it a night, retreating to our tents in the hope that sleep would provide an escape from the growing sense of unease. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. My mind raced, replaying the strange noises over and over again. I could hear my friends whispering in the other tents, their voices tinged with fear. The growls and footsteps continued, growing closer and more distinct. It felt like something was circling our campsite, watching us from the shadows. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a blood-curdling scream. It echoed through the forest, sending a jolt of terror through me. I shot up in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest. The scream was followed by frantic shouting, and I recognized the voice of one of my friends, Jake. I scrambled out of my tent, fumbling for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing Jake standing at the edge of the forest, his face twisted in terror. "There's something out there," he shouted, pointing into the trees. I saw it. I saw something. We all gathered around him, our flashlight sweeping through the dark forest. The trees cast long, eerie shadows, and the air was thick with tension. But there was nothing, no movement, no sign of whatever had terrified Jake. He was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "It was huge," he stammered, "standing on two legs, like a man, but but it wasn't human. It had glowing eyes, and it was watching me." We tried to calm him down, but the fear in his voice was contagious. The thought of some unknown creature lurking in the forest, watching us, sent chills down my spine. We decided to stay up for the rest of the night, keeping watch around the campfire. But as the hours dragged on, the sense of dread only grew stronger. Around 3 a.m., we heard it again, the low growl, coming from the direction of the creek. This time, it was closer, almost as if whatever it was had moved in on us. The sound was accompanied by the snapping of branches and the heavy footsteps that made the ground tremble. I could see the fear in my friend's eyes as we all pointed our flashlights toward the source of the noise. The beam of light fell on something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the forest was a figure, tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness. But the eyes, those glowing eyes, were unmistakable. They were fixed on us, unblinking, filled with a malevolent intelligence. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, as if it was deciding what to do next. Suddenly, the figure let out a deafening roar, a sound so primal and terrifying that it shook us to our core. We scattered in panic, grabbing whatever we could as we ran toward our cars. The night was filled with the sound of our frantic footsteps, and the creature's chilling growl echoing behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking area. Panting and out of breath, we fumbled with the car keys, desperate to escape. As we sped away from the campground, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the creature chasing after us. But the road was empty, the forest silent once again. We drove through the night, not stopping until we were far from Hollow Creek. None of us spoke, the terror of what we had encountered still fresh in our minds. When we finally reached civilization, we all knew that our lives had been changed forever. We had gone to Hollow Creek Campground for a weekend of fun, but we had left with something far more sinister, a memory of terror that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. To this day, I can't explain what we saw at Hollow Creek. Some of my friends refused to talk about it, while others have tried to rationalize it as a hallucination or a trick of the light. But I know what I saw, and I know that it was real. The glowing eyes, the growl, the sense of being hunted, it was no figment of my imagination. Hollow Creek Campground remains abandoned, a place where the trees whisper of secrets best left forgotten. I never thought I'd end up there again. The old hospital had been closed for over a decade, left to rot and decay on the outskirts of town, a relic of a time long past. But when the call came in, I had no choice. They needed someone to inspect the building to see if it could be salvaged, repurposed for something new. I was the only one available, and so I found myself driving down that lonely road, the memories of my time there as an intern flooding back with every mile. The hospital had always been an eerie place, even when it was still operational. It was one of those old, sprawling buildings with long, narrow hallways that seemed to stretch on forever, where the lights flickered constantly, and the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and despair. But what really made the place unsettling was the way it seemed to have a life of its own, a presence that watched you from the shadows, always just out of sight. I hadn't been back since it closed, hadn't wanted to, but as I pulled up to the front gate, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle over me. The gate was rusted and chained shut, but I had a key, given to me by the city official who'd called me in for the job. I unlocked the gate and pushed it open, the screech of metal against metal echoing in the silence. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring back at me. I parked the car and grabbed my flashlight, then headed toward the main entrance. The doors were locked, but a quick search of my key ring turned up the right key. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing the lobby beyond. It was just as I remembered it, dusty, decayed, but still eerily familiar. The front desk was still there, the chairs in the waiting area still lined up in neat rows, as if expecting patients who would never come I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and decay. I made my way through the lobby, past the reception desk, and into the main hallway. The walls were lined with peeling paint and faded posters, reminders of a time when this place had been full of life, full of people. Now it was a tomb, a place where the past lingered like a ghost, refusing to let go. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and twisting in the corners of my vision, always just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness, waiting for me to get too close. I reached the end of the hallway and stopped in front of a set of double doors. They were heavy, made of thick wood, with a sign above them that read surgical wing. This was where most of the activity had been when the hospital was still open, where the surgeons and nurses had worked tirelessly to save lives, where the patients had come in desperate for help. But it was also where the worst of the hospital's history was buried, the stories that no one wanted to talk about. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the doors open. The air was colder on the other side, the smell of decay more pronounced. The lights were still on in this wing, flickering dimly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I made my way down the corridor, passing empty rooms with rusted beds and broken equipment. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. I reached the end of the corridor and found myself in front of the operating theater. The doors were ajar, the room beyond dark and foreboding. I shined my flashlight inside, illuminating the room in a weak, yellowish glow. The operating table was still there, covered in dust and grime, the instruments scattered across the counters like the remnants of a long-forgotten battle. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The room felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked over to the table and brushed away some of the dust, revealing the stained metal beneath. It was then that I noticed the writing on the wall, scrawled in dark, dried blood. They never left. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, more solid, as if they were closing in on me. I could feel the presence now, stronger than ever, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. I had to get out of there, had to leave before it was too late. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I fled down the corridor, back the way I had come. The doors slammed shut behind me as I passed, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a gunshot. I could hear something behind me, footsteps, or maybe just the sound of the building settling, but I didn't stop to find out. I reached the main lobby and burst through the front doors, stumbling out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, finally managing to unlock the door and climb inside. I started the engine and sped away from that place, not daring to look back. I never went back to that hospital. Whatever was inside, whatever had been left behind when the doors closed for the last time, it was still there, waiting in the shadows. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes on me, watching from the darkness, waiting for me to make a mistake, to stay just a little too long. The city decided to demolish the building a few months later. They said it was too far gone to save, too dangerous to try and repair. But even now, years later, I can't help but wonder if they really got rid of whatever was inside. If maybe, just maybe, those shadows found a new place to hide, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble upon them. It was supposed to be just another night shift, another routine evening at Redburn factory. I had been working as a security guard there for almost a year, and the job was straightforward enough: patrol the grounds, keep an eye on the security cameras, and make sure everything was locked up tight. The factory had been in operation for decades, producing steel parts for machinery, and it was a sprawling complex of massive warehouses, assembly lines, and storage yards. It wasn't the kind of place that gave you the creeps. At least, not until that night. My shift started at 10 p.m. As usual, I made my rounds, checking all the doors and windows, making sure the alarms were set. The factory was eerily quiet at night, the hum of machinery replaced by an almost oppressive silence. The only sounds were the distant echoes of my footsteps and the occasional creak of metal settling in the cool night air. I had gotten used to the quiet, but that night something felt different off. Somehow. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I walked the darkened corridors dotted around midnight. I returned to the security office to monitor the cameras. The screens flickered with black and white footage of empty hallways, deserted loading docks, and still assembly lines. Everything seemed normal, but there was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to the long hours and the isolation, but the feeling only grew stronger as the night wore on. Around 1 a.m., I noticed something strange on one of the monitors. The camera covering the east wing of the factory, a section that had been shut down for renovations, flickered, then went black. I frowned, leaning closer to the screen. The camera had been working fine earlier in the evening, and there was no reason for it to suddenly go out. I switched to the backup camera for the same area, but it was also offline. A sense of unease settled in my gut. The east wing was supposed to be empty, no workers, no machinery, nothing. I decided to check it out, hoping it was just a technical glitch. But as I made my way through the factory, that feeling of dread grew stronger. The silence seemed to press in around me, the air thick with an almost tangible heaviness. When I reached the entrance to the east wing, I hesitated. The doors were locked as they should have been, but something didn't feel right. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. It was significantly colder in the east wing, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees. I walked down the main corridor, my footsteps echoing off the metal walls. The east wing had always been a little eerie, mostly due to its disuse, but tonight it felt different. There was a sense of presence, as if I wasn't alone. I reached the area where the cameras had gone offline and began inspecting the equipment. Everything seemed to be in order, but the cameras were still dead. As I was about to give up and head back to the office, I heard a noise behind me. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft, shuffling sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I turned around, my flashlight sweeping through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The corridor was empty, silent once again. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but as I turned to leave, I heard it again, this time closer. My heart started to race, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I took a few steps forward, my eyes straining to see through the shadows, but the corridor remained empty. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Just a flicker, a shadow darting across the edge of my vision. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly, but once again there was nothing there. The silence was deafening, broken only by the pounding of my heart. I was about to call it a night and report the malfunctioning cameras to maintenance, when the lights in the corridor suddenly flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The only light came from my flashlight, but it seemed dimmer now, barely penetrating the gloom dot, and then I felt it a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The air was so cold now that I could see my breath, and the sense of presence was overwhelming. I felt like I was being watched, like something was standing right behind me, just out of sight. I bolted. I didn't care about protocol or the cameras anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. I ran down the corridor, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I raced back towards the main factory floor. The shuffling noise followed me, growing louder, more insistent. But I didn't dare look back. I burst through the doors of the east wing and slammed them shut behind me, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The factory was silent again, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as soon as I was out of the east wing. But I knew something had followed me, something that didn't belong in this world. I rushed back to the security office and checked the cameras again. The east wing was still dark, the monitors showing nothing but static. But as I watched, I saw something move on one of the other screens, a shadow, just out of the camera's range, flitting across the edge of the frame. I stared at the screen, my heart in my throat, but the shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't go back to the east wing that night or ever again. I finished my shift in the relative safety of the security office, my eyes glued to the monitors, but nothing else happened. When my replacement arrived in the morning, I handed over my report, including the malfunctioning cameras, but I didn't mention what I had seen or felt. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to believe it myself. A few days later, the cameras in the east wing were repaired, and the lights were back on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I started looking for another job, and a month later, I left Redburn Factory for good. But the memory of that night still haunts me. I still see that shadow in the corner of my eye, still feel that cold hand on my shoulder. I've tried to forget, to move on, but some things stay with you, no matter how much you try to leave them behind. The summer I inherited Blackwood Manor was the summer everything changed. I'd never believed in curses or haunted houses, but that was before I found myself standing in front of the grand, decaying estate that had been in my family for generations. The manor had been abandoned for years, left to rot after my great-uncle passed away. No one in the family had wanted anything to do with it, and I didn't blame them. The stories that surrounded the place were enough to give anyone pause, but I wasn't one to believe in old wives' tales, and besides, I was in desperate need of a place to stay. The timing of the inheritance felt like fate. As I pushed open the heavy iron gates, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding wash over me. The manor loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty, like eyes watching my every move. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, the once beautiful gardens now wild and untamed. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and I could hear the distant sound of crows cawing, as if warning me to turn back. But I was determined I would fix up the old place, make it my own. I wasn't going to let some silly stories scare me away. The front door was heavy, made of dark, polished wood, and creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The air inside was stale, musty, like a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight that filtered through the dirty windows, and the floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. The interior was just as I remembered it from my childhood, grand, imposing, and utterly terrifying. The walls were lined with portraits of my ancestors, their eyes following me as I made my way through the darkened halls. The furniture was old and covered in white sheets, like forgotten ghosts waiting to be uncovered. The silence was oppressive, the kind that presses down on you, makes you feel like you're being watched. I spent the first few days cleaning, trying to make the place livable. The electricity still worked, thankfully, and I managed to get the water running after some tinkering with the old pipes. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone in the house. It started with small things, a door that would be open when I knew I'd closed it, the faint sound of footsteps in the middle of the night, shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the old house was playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew there was something more. One night I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a soft whisper, like someone was speaking right next to my ear. I shot up, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I turned on the light, trying to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I decided to explore the house, to see if I could find the source of the strange occurrences. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down to the basement, the one part of the house I had avoided since I arrived. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was damp and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. I shone the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing cobwebs and dust-covered shelves. But as I moved deeper into the room, I saw an old wooden chest, half buried under a pile of old rags. The chest was small, about the size of a suitcase, and covered in strange symbols that I didn't recognize. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for it, something deep inside me screaming not to open it, that I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was inside. The lid creaked as I pried it open, and a cold gust of air seemed to escape from within, sending a shiver down my spine. Inside, I found a bundle of old, yellowed papers tied with a red ribbon, and something else, a small, blackened book, its cover cracked and worn with age. The book seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it was alive, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I picked it up. The cover was embossed with more of the strange symbols, and the pages were filled with writing I couldn't understand, written in a language I had never seen before. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a sense of unease wash over me, a feeling that I had just unleashed something terrible. I shoved the book back into the chest and closed the lid, my hands shaking. I tried to convince myself it was just an old book, that there was nothing to be afraid of, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just opened a door that was never meant to be opened. The strange occurrences only got worse after that. The whispers became more frequent, louder, like someone was standing right next to me, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I started seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes that moved through the halls, always just out of reach. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find the room freezing cold, my breath visible in the air, and the feeling of something watching me, something that wasn't human. One night I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the window at the end of the hall. I shone the flashlight down the corridor, but there was nothing there, just empty space. But as I turned to go back to bed, I saw a dark figure standing at the end of the hall, just outside the circle of light. It was tall, its form shifting and changing, like it was made of shadows. I froze, unable to move, as it slowly started to move toward me. I backed up, my heart racing, but it was getting closer. its form solidifying with each step. I turned and ran back into my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear it outside the door, the sound of its footsteps echoing in the silence. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer, that whatever was in the house had been awakened, and it wasn't going to let me leave. I grabbed my things and fled the house, not stopping until I was miles away. The Manor just a dark silhouette in the distance. I never went back to Blackwood Manor. The house was sold not long after, but I've heard stories of the new owners experiencing the same things I did, of the whispers in the night, of the shadows that move on their own, of the dark figure that roams the halls. I don't know what was in that book, or what I unleashed when I opened that chest, but I do know one thing: I'll never forget the curse of Blackwood Manor, and I'll never go back to that place, no matter what. The night I had the encounter, I wasn't supposed to be there. Pinewood Forest wasn't a place people visited after dark, especially not alone. The locals had 1,000 reasoned stories of strange sightings, rumors of disappearances, even tales of a beast that roamed the woods. But I wasn't from around there. I was just passing through, on a solo camping trip to clear my head after a tough year. The forest seemed peaceful enough during the day, and I wasn't about to let a few superstitions ruin my plans. I set up camp a little before sunset, finding a spot near a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. The air was cool, and the fading light filtered through the trees in a golden glow. It was almost idyllic, the kind of place that made you forget about the world for a while. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for a quiet evening under the stars. By the time the sky was fully dark, the forest had taken on a different feel. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I tried to enjoy the solitude, but there was an unease I couldn't shake, a feeling like I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, that I wasn't used to being alone in the wilderness at night, but that didn't make the feeling go away. It was around midnight when I first heard a low growl, deep and resonant, coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to see into the trees. At first I thought it might be a bear or a coyote, but the growl didn't sound right. It was too guttural, too intelligent, if that makes sense. Like it wasn't just a warning, but something more. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the woods, sweeping the beam across the trees. The light bounced off the trunks and undergrowth, but I didn't see anything unusual. The growl had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had intensified, as if whatever was out there was waiting for me to let my guard down. I kept the flashlight trained on the trees, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe curious about the campfire. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The growl had come from something that wasn't just passing through the woods. It was hunting. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting the light from the flashlight. They were high off the ground, too high for a normal animal, and they glowed with an unnatural yellow light. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized those eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, full of malevolent intent. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, as I stared into those eyes. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, radiating an aura of fear that gripped me in place. The creature was still hidden in the shadows, but I could sense its size, its power. It was massive, larger than any bear, and the way it moved, silent and deliberate, made it clear this wasn't an ordinary predator. Slowly, the creature began to step forward, and I caught my first glimpse of it in the dim light. It was walking on two legs, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its limbs were long and muscular, with hands or paws ending in razor-sharp claws, but it was the face that truly terrified me. It had the snout and ears of a dog, but the eyes and posture of something almost human. This was no ordinary animal, it was the dogman, the legendary beast the locals had whispered about for generations. Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it out in front of me, trying to keep the creature at bay. The dogman stopped, its lips curling back to reveal long, sharp teeth. It growled again, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. For a moment I thought it might lunge at me, tear me apart with those claws and teeth. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching me, as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. I don't know how long we stood like that, locked in a silent standoff. Time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing down to just me and the beast. I could feel my arm growing tired, the weight of the burning stick almost too much to bear, but I didn't dare lower it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the dogman stepped back, melting into the shadows. The yellow eyes lingered for a moment longer, and then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, the forest holding its breath, as if waiting for the creature to return. I didn't wait to find out. I quickly packed up my gear, dousing the fire and grabbing my flashlight. I knew I couldn't stay there, not with that thing lurking in the woods. I didn't care about the dangers of hiking at night. I just needed to get out of that forest. I hiked through the night, my heart pounding with every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. The forest felt alive with unseen eyes, the shadows shifting and moving just beyond the reach of my flashlight. But I didn't see the dogman again. It was as if it had vanished into the night, leaving me to flee in terror. When I finally emerged from the woods at dawn, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed, but I was alive. I had survived the encounter, but I knew I would never forget it. The image of those glowing yellow eyes, the cold intelligence behind them, was burned into my memory. I reported what I saw to the local authorities, but they didn't believe me. They said it was probably a bear, or maybe a wolf, and that I had just let my imagination get the better of me. But I knew what I saw. I knew it wasn't something natural, something that belonged in this world. I never went back to Pinewood Forest, and I never will. Whatever is out there, it's still lurking in those woods, waiting for its next victim. And the thought of those glowing yellow eyes watching me from the darkness is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. When I first accepted the job at Ridgeview Hospital, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The hospital was an old building, one that had stood for over a century, with a reputation that was anything but comforting. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and respect. But I was desperate for work, and the pay was decent, so I pushed aside the rumors and took the job as a night shift nurse. The first night was uneventful, just the usual rounds and paperwork. The hospital was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the occasional beeping of machines and the soft whispers of nurses at the station. The halls were dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and wrap around the corners. But I told myself it was nothing. After all, it was just an old building, right? As the nights went on, I began to notice things that didn't make sense, small things at first. A wheelchair left in the middle of the hall when I knew it had been parked by the wall, lights flickering in rooms that were supposed to be empty, the feeling of being watched when I was alone. I mentioned it to one of the other nurses, an older woman who had been there for years. She just shrugged and said, "Ridgeview has its quirks. You'll get used to it." I wasn't so sure. One night I was making my rounds on the third floor, the oldest part of the hospital. Most of the rooms were empty, save for a few long-term patients who rarely had visitors. As I walked down the hall, I noticed a light on in one of the rooms. I thought it was strange since I hadn't seen anyone enter, but I assumed it was just another nurse checking in on a patient. When I reached the room, I saw a woman sitting in a chair by the window, her back to me. She was dressed in an old-fashioned hospital gown, the kind they used in the early 1900s. Her long, dark hair fell in waves down her back, and she seemed to be staring out the window. "Mom, do you need any help?" I asked. Stepping into the room, the woman didn't respond. I moved closer, my unease growing with each step. When I reached her side, I gasped. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes wide and empty, like she was staring at something only she could see. I reached out to touch her, but my hand went right through her. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but when I looked again, the woman was gone. The chair was empty, the room silent. I left the room as quickly as I could, my mind racing with questions. Who was that woman? Was she a ghost, or was I just imagining things? I decided not to mention it to anyone, afraid they would think I was losing my mind. But that wasn't the last time I saw her. Over the next few weeks, I saw her several more times, always in that same room, always staring out the window. Each time, she would disappear as soon as I got close, leaving me feeling cold and unsettled. One night, as I was finishing my rounds, I heard a noise coming from the basement. The basement was off limits to most staff, but I had heard stories of strange happenings, of things moving on their own, of voices echoing in the darkness. I should have ignored it, but something compelled me to go down there, to see for myself what was going on. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from my flashlight, which flickered as I moved deeper into the room. The walls were lined with old equipment, gurneys, wheelchairs, machines that hadn't been used in decades. I could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. As I moved further into the basement, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the room, was a gurney covered in a white sheet. The sheet was stained with something dark, something that looked like blood. My hand shook as I approached it, my flashlight barely illuminating the darkened room. I reached out to pull back the sheet, but before I could, the lights flickered on, blinding me for a moment. When my eyes adjusted, I saw them dozens of figures standing around the gurney, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes empty and hollow. They were dressed in old hospital gowns, their skin a sickly shade of gray. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with those empty eyes. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I turned to run, I felt something grab my arm, something cold and clammy. I screamed, but no sound came out. I looked down and saw the hand of one of the figures, its grip like ice, holding me in place. I struggled to break free, but it was no use. The grip tightened, pulling me closer to the gurney. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, my vision starting to blur. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the grip loosened and I fell to the floor. The lights flickered off again, plunging the room into darkness. When I looked up, the figures were gone, the basement empty once more. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I ran out of the basement as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back on the main floor, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? but I knew I couldn't stay at Ridgeview Hospital any longer. I handed in my resignation the next day, packed my things, and left the town, never looking back. But the memories still haunt me. The woman in the room, the figures in the basement, they were real. I know they were. And sometimes, late at night, I can still feel that cold grip on my arm. Still see those empty eyes staring at me from the darkness. Ridgeview Hospital may be just a building, just bricks and mortar, but there's something there, something that shouldn't be, something that won't let go, no matter how far you run. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything changed. Tanner Holloway was just a regular guy, the kind of person wouldn't look twice at on the street. He worked as a mechanic in a small town, lived in a modest house on the edge of town, and spent most of his free time either fixing up old cars or hanging out with his childhood friends. But on that particular night, something unexplainable happened, something that would haunt him and everyone who knew him for the rest of their lives. Tanner had always been the skeptical type. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of that supernatural nonsense. He'd heard the stories, of course everyone in town had, but he dismissed them as the stuff of overactive imaginations or just plain old folklore. So when his friend, Mark, suggested they mess around with an old Ouija board he'd found in his grandmother's attic, Tanner didn't think twice about joining in. It was just a harmless game, right? They met up at Mark's house, a creaky old place that had seen better days. The group included Tanner, Mark, their mutual friend Jason, and Mark's younger sister, Emily. They gathered around the kitchen table, lit a few candles to set the mood, and placed the Ouija board in the center. The air was filled with a sense of nervous excitement, but Tanner couldn't help but roll his eyes at how seriously everyone else was taking it. "Come on, guys," Tanner said with a smirk. "You don't actually believe this thing works, do you?" "Just wait and see," Mark replied, his voice low and serious. "People say this board has a history. My grandma never touched it after she got it. Said it gave her the creeps." Tanner shrugged. "Whatever. Let's just get this over with." They all placed their fingers lightly on the planchette, the small heart-shaped piece of wood used to spell out messages on the board. Mark started off with the usual questions. "Is anyone here with us? Can you give us a sign?" But nothing happened. The planchette didn't move, and the only sound in the room was the faint crackling of the candles. After a few minutes, Tanner began to lose patience. "See, it's just a stupid game. You guys are wasting your time." But just as he was about to lift his hand from the planchette, it started to move slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Tanner felt a chill run down his spine as the planchette spelled out the word yes. The group exchanged nervous glances, and Tanner felt his skepticism waver. He couldn't explain what was happening, but he wasn't about to let fear get the best of him. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The planchette moved again, spelling out Anna. None of them knew anyone named Anna, but before they could ask more, the planchette continued to spell out a message. IWSHURT. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "Hurt? How, by who?" But instead of answering, the planchette suddenly stopped moving. The room grew colder, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. Tanner's heart raced as a deep sense of unease settled over him. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Suddenly, the planchette jerked violently, spelling out one final word. "Tanner." The candles were snuffed out in an instant, plunging the room into darkness. Tanner felt a surge of panic, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. He could hear the others moving around, frantically trying to relight the candles. But all he could think about was that one word, his name. When the candles were finally relit, Tanner noticed something strange. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and he could sense a presence in the room that hadn't been there before. His skin prickled with fear as he looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just his friends, all staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. "What the hell was that?" Jason asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Mark replied, his face pale. "But I think we should stop. This isn't right." Tanner wanted to agree, to get out of that house as fast as he could, but something held him back. It was like an invisible force was pulling him toward the board, urging him to continue, against his better judgment. He placed his hand back on the planchette. "No," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to finish this. We can't leave it open." Reluctantly, the others followed his lead, placing their fingers on the planchette once more. Tanner asked one final question, his voice trembling with a fear he could no longer hide. "Anna, what do you want from me?" The planchette moved quickly, almost angrily, spelling out the word BODY. Before anyone could react, Tanner felt a sudden, intense pain in his chest, like something was trying to claw its way inside him. He gasped, doubling over as the pain spread through his body, searing every nerve with agony. He could hear the others shouting, their voices distant and muffled, as if they were miles away. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pain stopped. Tanner collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling with fear. He could feel something inside him, something dark and malevolent, writhing just beneath the surface. It was as if his very soul had been tainted, corrupted by whatever had come through that board. When he finally managed to stand, he saw the fear in his friends' eyes. They backed away from him, their faces pale with terror. Tanner tried to speak, to reassure them that he was okay, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, constricted, and he could feel someone else trying to take control. The days that followed were a blur. Tanner could feel the presence inside him growing stronger, its influence spreading like a disease. His thoughts became darker, his actions more erratic. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with no memory of the previous hours. His friends tried to help him, but there was nothing they could do. Whatever had possessed him was too powerful, too determined. Tanner's life spiraled out of control. He lost his job, his friends distanced themselves, and his family was at a loss for what to do. They took him to doctors, priests, anyone who might be able to help, but no one could explain what was happening to him. It was as if Tanner was slowly being consumed by the entity inside him, his own personality fading away. The worst part was the nightmares. Every night Tanner would dream of Anna, twisted, malevolent figure who would torment him in his sleep. She would laugh at his suffering, whispering dark promises of what was to come. And every morning he would wake up with the same sense of dread, knowing that the line between dream and reality was becoming increasingly blurred. As the weeks turned into months, Tanner's condition worsened. He became a shell of his former self, his one strong body gaunt and weak, his mind fractured by the relentless torment. And yet, through it all, he clung to the hope that somehow, some way, he could rid himself of the entity that had taken over his life. But hope was a fleeting thing. One night, as Tanner lay in bed, he felt the presence stronger than ever before. It was as if Anna had finally gathered enough strength to fully take control. Tanner fought with every ounce of willpower he had left, but it was no use. The darkness consumed him, pulling him down into a void of despair and pain. The last thing Tanner remembered before everything went black was the sound of his own voice, only it wasn't his voice anymore. It was deeper, more sinister, and it spoke in a language he didn't understand. The words were foreign, ancient, and filled with a power that terrified him to his core. When Tanner woke the next morning, he wasn't alone. The entity had fully taken over, pushing Tanner's consciousness to the back of his own mind. He could see and hear everything, but he had no control over his actions. He was a prisoner in his own body, forced to watch as the entity used him to carry out its dark deeds. In the days that followed, Tanner, or rather, the entity that now inhabited his body, committed unspeakable acts. It left a trail of chaos and destruction in its wake, with Tanner helpless to stop it. He could only watch in horror as the entity reveled in its newfound freedom, its thirst for suffering. Unquenchable. By the time the authorities caught up with Tanner, it was too late. The entity had taken full control, leaving nothing of the man he once was. They found him in a small, abandoned house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by the remnants of the horrors he had unleashed. But even as they apprehended him, the entity continued to laugh, its malevolent voice echoing in Tanner's mind. And so Tanner Holloway was lost, his body a vessel for something far darker, his soul trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The townspeople spoke in hushed whispers of the man who had been possessed, of the evil that had taken root in their quiet community. But no one knew the full extent of what had happened, or what became of Tanner after he was taken away. All that remains are the stories of the man who was consumed by darkness, and the entity that now roams the earth in his place. Some say Tanner's soul is still out there, trapped in the void, waiting for the day when he can finally break free. But until then, his story serves as a warning, a reminder that some doors should never be opened, and some games are better left unplayed. I had always been a city guy, born and raised in a bustling metropolis where the night was never truly dark, and the streets were always filled with the sounds of life. So when I moved to the small town of Maple Creek, it felt like stepping into a different world. The town was nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by miles of dense, uncharted wilderness. It was quiet, peaceful, and more than a little eerie, but I needed the change, or so I thought. My decision to relocate was driven by a job offer I couldn't refuse. The local government needed someone to manage a new wildlife conservation project, and I, with my background in environmental science, seemed like the perfect fit. The work was exciting, and the prospect of living in such a beautiful, untouched part of the world appealed to me. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated: the isolation. I rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, right at the edge of the forest. It was a charming little place, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and a porch that offered stunning views of the surrounding woods. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a strange sense of unease. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. But whenever I looked around, there was nothing there, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. The townspeople were friendly enough, but they kept to themselves. They were an insular community, wary of outsiders, and it took time for them to warm up to me. I noticed that they were particularly superstitious, with a strong belief in old legends and folklore. One of the most persistent stories was that of the dogman, a creature that was said to roam the woods at night, half-man, half-wolf, with glowing eyes and a howl that could chill your blood. I dismissed the stories as nothing more than local lore, meant to scare newcomers and entertain the kids. But there was something in the way the older folks talked about the dogman that gave me pause. They didn't laugh or smile when they mentioned it. Instead, their faces grew serious, and they would quickly change the subject, as if speaking of the creature could summon it. One night I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the crisp autumn air, when I heard it, a long, mournful howl echoing through the trees. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, and it sent a shiver down my spine. The sound was distant, but it seemed to carry a primal intensity that made my heart race. I tried to tell myself it was just a vol for a coyote, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Over the next few nights the howling continued, growing louder and more frequent. It seemed to be getting closer, too, as if whatever was making that sound was circling my cabin, drawing nearer with each passing night. I found myself staying up late, unable to sleep, straining my ears for any sign of movement outside. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. Then, one night I saw it. I had been lying in bed, trying unsuccessfully to fall asleep, when I heard a rustling outside my window. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just the silhouettes of trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure tall, hunched, and covered in coarse, dark fur. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its elongated snout was lifted to the sky as it let out a low, guttural growl. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The creature's gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment it felt like time stood still. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it vanished into the trees, leaving me standing there, trembling with fear. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fireplace, every creak and groan of the cabin sending my nerves into overdrive. By morning, I had convinced myself that I must have imagined the whole thing, that it was just a nightmare brought on by too many ghost stories. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was out there, something that shouldn't exist. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the fear never left me. I began to notice strange things around the cabin, deep claw marks on the trees, footprints in the mud that were far too large to be human, and a lingering, foul odor that seemed to permeate the air. I knew I had to tell someone, but who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. One evening, as I was walking back from town, I decided to take a different route, hoping to clear my mind. The path wound through the woods, cutting through a dense thicket of trees. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and the air was filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and chirping insects. For a moment I almost felt at peace. But then the howling started again, closer this time, and my heart leapt into my throat. I quickened my pace, glancing nervously over my shoulder. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting into gnarled, claw-like shapes. The howling grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making that sound was chasing me. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and I could feel the creature gaining on me, its hot breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare look back. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't make it out alive. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst out of the woods and into a clearing. The lights of my cabin were just ahead, and I sprinted toward them, my legs burning with exhaustion. I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it with trembling hands. The howling continued outside, the relentless, bone-chilling wail that seemed to go on forever. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fireplace, clutching a hunting knife I'd found in the cabin, my eyes fixed on the door. The howling eventually stopped, but I knew the creature was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in Maple Creek any longer. I packed my bags, loaded them into my truck, and drove out of town without looking back. The townspeople watched me go, their expressions unreadable, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to put as much distance between myself and that cursed forest as possible. I never spoke of what happened to anyone who would believe me. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and the wind is just right, I think I can still hear that haunting howl echoing in the distance. And I wonder, did I escape, or is it just a matter of time before the dogman finds me again? The announcement came over the intercom just as I was wrapping up my last class of the day. Attention, Ridgeway High, we are initiating a lockdown. This is not a drill. The words sent a chill down my spine. As a teacher, I'd been through lockdown drills countless times, but this felt different. There was something in the principal's voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly locked the classroom door and turned off the lights, motioning for my students to gather in the corner, away from the windows. They moved quietly, their faces pale with fear. I could hear whispers and the occasional stifled sob as they huddled together, trying to make sense of what was happening. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had to stay calm. They were looking to me for reassurance, and I couldn't let them down. The school was eerily silent. The usual sounds of lockers slamming, students chattering, and teachers giving lessons had been replaced by an oppressive, suffocating quiet. The only noise was the faint hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of the building settling. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of what had triggered the lockdown. But there was nothing, just that maddening silence. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I glanced at the clock, but it felt like the hands were barely moving. My thoughts were racing, running through all the possible scenarios. An active shooter, a dangerous intruder. The unknown was the worst part. Not knowing what was out there, not knowing how to protect my students, was driving me to the edge of panic. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from down the hallway, followed by the sound of something or someone running. My students gasped, and I felt my pulse quicken. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against it, trying to make out what was happening. The footsteps were getting closer, and they didn't sound like they belonged to a person. They were too heavy, too uneven. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What was out there? My rational brain was telling me it was just a frightened student or maybe a teacher trying to find safety. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. There was something wrong about those footsteps, something that didn't belong in a school. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, praying that whoever or whatever was out there would move on. But then the door handle began to rattle. My students huddled closer together, their eyes wide with terror. I could see the fear in their faces, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and let whatever was out there get in. I motioned for the students to stay quiet and move to the back of the room, where I kept a heavy wooden chair. I lifted it, the weight reassuring in my hands, and positioned myself by the door, ready to strike if the intruder got through. The rattling grew more intense, as if whoever was out there was becoming more desperate to get in. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, nothing to indicate that anyone was still out there. I didn't dare move. The students were silent, too, their eyes fixed on me, waiting for some kind of direction. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, I decided to risk it. I set the chair down and slowly approached the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I knew it was a terrible idea. I'd seen enough horror movies to know that, but I had to know what was going on. I had to know if it was safe. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door, cracking it open just a sliver. I peered out into the hallway, expecting to see, well, I wasn't sure what I expected to see, but what I saw was nothing. The hallway was empty, as if the school had been abandoned. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. But there was no sign of anyone, no students, no teachers, no intruders. I opened the door wider, stepping out into the hallway. My footsteps echoed in the silence, and I felt a cold draft coming from somewhere further down the corridor. I turned back to my classroom and motioned for the students to stay put. They nodded, their faces still pale with fear, and I closed the door behind me. Leaving it unlocked, I made my way down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The school felt different, as if it had been swallowed up by some kind of malevolent force. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I was a teacher, that I had a responsibility to protect my students. But it was getting harder to think clearly. As I turned a corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the hallway, was a trail of blood. It wasn't a small amount. Either it was a thick, dark smear that stretched from one end of the corridor to the other. I stared at it, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't supposed to happen in a school. I followed the trail, my feet moving on their own as if they were drawn to whatever was at the end of it. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around me. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. Finally, I reached the end of the trail. It led to a door, the door to the school's basement. I'd been down there a few times, mostly to help with maintenance or retrieve supplies, but it had always given me the creeps. It was dark, damp, and filled with a labyrinth of narrow corridors that seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, wondering if I should turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was going on. I had to find out what had happened to the students and staff. I opened the door and stepped into the basement. The air was colder down here, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. The lights were dim, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I could hear a faint, dripping sound coming from somewhere deep within the basement. But other than that, it was deathly silent. I followed the blood trail down a narrow corridor, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The further I went, the darker it got, until I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, using the flashlight to light my way. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing more blood splatters on the walls and floor. I turned a corner and stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the corridor, was a figure. It was hunched over, its back to me, but I could see that it was covered in blood. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to run. But my body wouldn't listen. As I got closer, the figure slowly turned its head to look at me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The face that stared back at me was twisted, distorted, as if it had been stretched and pulled in unnatural ways. Its eyes were empty, black voids, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. The figure stood up, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. It took a step toward me, and I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The light flickered, casting the figure in and out of darkness, making it seem even more monstrous. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around me. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps heavy and uneven, getting closer and closer. I pushed myself harder, willing my legs to move faster, but it felt like I was running through quicksand. I burst through the door at the end of the hallway and slammed it shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was no making sense of it. What I had seen was impossible. Something out of a nightmare. I didn't wait to find out if the figure was following me. I ran back to my classroom, threw open the door, and ushered my students out. They didn't ask questions. They could see the fear in my eyes, and that was enough to spur them into action. We made our way to the nearest exit, the only thought in my mind being to get them out of the school and to safety. As we stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But that relief was short-lived. I turned to look at the school one last time, and in one of the windows I saw the figure watching us, its twisted grin still plastered on its face. We never found out what had caused the lockdown that day. The police investigated, but they couldn't explain the blood trail, the strange figure, or the disappearance of several students and staff members. Ridgeway High was closed down shortly after that, and the building was left to rot. But sometimes, when I drive by the old school, I swear I can still see that figure standing in the window, watching, waiting. And I know that whatever it was, it's still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. It all started when I was house hunting. My wife, Lisa, and I had been saving for years to buy our first home, and we finally had enough to start looking. We had a modest budget, so we weren't expecting to find anything extravagant. Just a simple place we could call our own. One Saturday afternoon, we were driving through a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town when we saw it, a charming old house with a for sale sign in the yard. The house was a bit run down, but it had character: a large front porch, a steeply pitched roof, and a row of tall windows that gave it an inviting look. The price was well within our budget, almost too good to be true. We called the real estate agent listed on the sign and arranged a viewing for the next day. The agent, a woman named Margaret, met us at the house. She was a friendly, middle-aged woman with a warm smile, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of unease, that I noticed as she led us inside. The interior of the house was just as charming as the outside, with hardwood floors, tall ceilings, and a spacious living room with a fireplace. But as we walked through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside was heavy, almost oppressive, and there was a faint, musty smell that seemed to cling to everything. Margaret showed us the bedrooms, the kitchen, and the bathroom, all of which were in need of some updating, but nothing we couldn't handle. The last room she showed us was the basement. The moment she opened the door to the basement, a cold draft swept up the stairs, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were made of rough stone, and there was an old wooden workbench in one corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. "It's a bit damp down here," Margaret said, her voice echoing off the stone walls, "but nothing a dehumidifier couldn't fix." Lisa didn't seem bothered by the basement, but I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. There was something about that basement that made me want to leave the house and never come back. Still, the price was right, and Lisa loved the house, so we decided to make an offer. The process moved quickly, and within a few weeks, we were the proud owners of the Hollow House. Moving day was exciting. We spent the day unpacking and arranging furniture, and by evening we were exhausted, but happy to finally be in our new home. That night, as we settled into bed, the house was eerily quiet. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the old house creaks and groans as it settled, the wind rattling the windows, and the distant hum of traffic from the nearby road. But beneath those sounds I heard something else, something faint and almost imperceptible, a soft whispering, like the murmur of voices coming from the walls. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of exhaustion and the stress of moving, and eventually I fell asleep. Over the next few days, the unease I had felt in the basement began to spread throughout the house. The musty smell grew stronger, and the whispering sounds became more distinct, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with us. Lisa noticed it, too, though she tried to brush it off as the quirks of an old house. But the whispering grew louder at night, filling the rooms with an unsettling presence. One night, about a week after we moved in, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they echoed through the house, coming from the hallway just outside our bedroom door. I sat up, my heart racing, and listened. The footsteps stopped, but the whispering continued, louder now, almost frantic. I nudged Lisa awake, but she didn't hear anything, just roll over and went back to sleep. I got out of bed and crept to the door, opening it slowly. The hallway was empty, but the whispering seemed to be coming from downstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the stairs, every step feeling like a descent into something dark and unknown. The whispering grew louder as I reached the first floor, a chorus of disembodied voices filling the air around me. I followed the sound to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, and when I pulled the door open, the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. The basement was dark, the single bulb casting long shadows on the stone walls. I shone the flashlight around the room, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there, just the workbench, the damp walls, and the old stone floor. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange, a small door in the corner of the basement that I hadn't seen before. It was made of wood, old and weathered, with rusty hinges and a tarnished brass handle. I walked over to it, the whispering starting up again, faint and distant, as if coming from behind the door. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and opened it. The door creaked loudly, and as it swung open, a blast of cold air hit me, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something else, something foul and rotten. Beyond the door was a narrow passage, carved into the stone, leading into darkness. I stepped back, a feeling of dread washing over me. There was no way I was going into that passage. I slammed the door shut and hurried back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. That night, the whispering grew louder than ever, filling the house with a cacophony of voices. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the house, that we were not alone. The next day, I called Margaret, demanding to know if there was anything unusual about the house, anything she hadn't told us. She hesitated before answering, her voice tense. There were ... rumors, she said finally, about the previous owners. They disappeared, vanished without a trace. The police never found any evidence of foul play, but the house has a reputation. She paused, and I could hear the fear in her voice. Some people say it's cursed, that the house takes people. I hung up the phone, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but there was something about that house, something that felt ... wrong. I told Lisa what Margaret had said, but she dismissed it, saying it was just an old house with a lot of history. But I could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that she was trying to hide. That night, the whispering was unbearable, the voices louder than ever, filling every room with their maddening chorus. I couldn't take it any more. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage and went down to the basement, determined to find out what was behind that door. The door creaked open easily, and I stepped into the passage, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, and the whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be coming from all around me. The passage was narrow and dark, the walls closing in as I made my way deeper into the earth. I could feel the weight of the stone pressing down on me, the air growing colder with every step. Finally, the passage opened up into a small chamber, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The walls of the chamber were covered in strange symbols, similar to the ones on the stones in the forest clearing. In the center of the room was an old stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs, and lying on the altar, surrounded by decaying flowers and rotting candles, was a small wooden box. I reached out and touched the box, and the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, echoing silence. The box was cold to the touch, and as I lifted it, I felt a strange energy pulsing from within. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking, and inside I found a small black book, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. I took the book and hurried back up the passage, the whispering starting up again, louder and more frantic with every step. I could feel something following me, a presence that pressed in from all sides. But I didn't stop, didn't look back until I was out of the basement and back in the safety of the living room. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, then sat down at the kitchen table, the book in front of me. I knew I shouldn't open it, knew that whatever was in that book was connected to the curse on the house. But I couldn't resist. I had to know. I opened the book and began to read, the words written in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The book told the story of the house, of the people who had lived there before, of the dark rituals they had performed in the basement, and the curse they had placed on the house to protect their secrets. The more I read, the more I felt the presence in the house growing stronger, the whispering louder, the air thicker with an oppressive energy. By the time I finished, I knew there was no escape. The house was alive, and it had taken us, just as it had taken the others before. I closed the book and looked around the room, feeling the walls closing in, the darkness creeping closer. The house had us now, and there was no way out. That night, the whispering was louder than ever, filling every corner of the house, the voices screaming in my ears. Lisa and I huddled together in the living room, the flashlight flickering, the air growing colder and colder. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The house was silent, the air still and heavy. We didn't move, didn't breathe, waiting for something to happen, for the darkness to swallow us whole. But nothing came. Morning light streamed through the windows, and the house seemed normal again, the oppressive energy gone, the whispering silenced. But we knew it wasn't over. The house was just waiting, biding its time, lulling us into a false sense of security before it took us for good. We packed our things and left that day, leaving everything behind, determined never to return. But even now, far away from that cursed place, I can still hear the whispering, still feel the presence of the house in the back of my mind, waiting, watching, waiting for the day, and it will take us back. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, or break from the hustle and bustle of city life. When the opportunity arose to manage a summer camp for a few days, I jumped at the chance. Elmwood Camp was nestled deep in the woods, far away from the noise of civilization. It promised tranquility and a chance to reconnect with nature. What I didn't anticipate was the nightmare that awaited me. Arriving at Elmwood Camp, I was struck by its remote beauty. The sprawling woods, the serene lake, and the cozy cabin seemed perfect for relaxation. My role was straightforward: oversee the campgrounds, ensure everything was in order, and keep an eye on a small group of campers who would arrive the next day. I spent the first evening unpacking and getting familiar with the camp's layout. The night was calm, with only the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures breaking the silence. The next morning, a group of 10 children arrived with their parents. They were eager and excited, their laughter filling the air. We went through the usual introductions, organized the sleeping arrangements, and planned the activities for the week. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until the night when the atmosphere shifted about as the sun set. The camp took on a different character. The once friendly woods seemed darker, and the wind carried an unsettling chill. The children were tucked into their cabins, and I made my rounds, checking that everything was secure. Just as I was about to head to my own cabin, I noticed something odd, a faint light flickering near the edge of the woods. Curious, I decided to investigate. I followed the light, which appeared to be coming from an old, decrepit cabin hidden among the trees. It hadn't been used in years, its paint peeling and the structure sagging. The light flickered from within, casting eerie shadows through the cracks in the walls. I approached cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The light seemed to dance just out of reach, leading me to the door of the abandoned cabin. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, and the smell of mildew and decay hit me. Inside, the cabin was empty except for a single, flickering lantern in the center of the room. It was the source of the light I had seen. I picked up the lantern, inspecting it closely. It was old and rusted, but it still worked, its flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. I set the lantern back down and decided to leave. As I turned to go, I heard a faint whisper voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. It felt as though the voice was calling me, urging me to stay. Suddenly, the lantern went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it was gone. Panic set in, and I could feel my heart racing. The whispering continued, growing louder and more frantic. I stumbled toward the door, my hands outstretched in front of me, but it felt as though the walls were closing in. Just as I reached the door, the whispering stopped. I pushed it open and stepped outside, gasping for air. The camp was quiet again, the earlier sense of foreboding replaced by an eerie calm. I hurried back to my cabin, locking the door behind me. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I had been spooked by the old cabin and its strange lantern. The next day, the children were excited for their first full day of activities. We went hiking, swimming, and had a campfire in the evening. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That night, as I was settling into bed, I heard it again, the whispering. It was faint but unmistakable. It seemed to be coming from outside, from the direction of the old cabin. I tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew louder throughout the night. I decided to investigate again, though I was filled with dread. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something odd: footprints leading up to the door. They were small, childlike, and they seemed to end abruptly at the entrance. My heart skipped a beat. The children were all accounted for. So who had made these tracks? I entered the cabin, finding it exactly as I had left it. The lantern was still there, its flame flickering weakly. I felt a chill run down my spine and decided to leave. But as I turned to go, I heard a child's voice clearly this time. It was soft and sad, saying, "Help us." I froze, my mind racing. The voice seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. I knelt down, trying to see if there was a way to lift them. The whispering grew louder, more desperate. I could hear children's voices now, a chorus of pleas and cries for help. With a surge of courage, I pried up a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a small, dusty space, but there was nothing inside. I searched the cabin, but found no evidence of anything unusual, no hidden compartments, no signs of recent use. By the time I returned to my cabin, the sun was rising. I was exhausted, but tried to focus on the day ahead. However, the strange occurrences continued. Items in the camp would go missing, only to reappear in odd places. The whispering grew more frequent, and the children began to complain of hearing voices at night. They were scared, and their parents were growing concerned. That night I decided to confront whatever was causing the disturbances. I went to the cabin one last time, determined to find answers. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices begging for release. I followed the sound to a hidden basement I had discovered during my earlier search. It was a small, dark space filled with old, forgotten items, children's toys, clothing, and other personal effects. As I searched through the basement, I found an old journal. It was covered in dust, its pages yellow with age. I opened it carefully, reading the entries. They spoke of a group of children who had been brought to the camp years ago, children who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The final entry was a chilling plea: "Help us. We are trapped." I closed the journal, my mind reeling. The whispers, the voices, I realized they were the spirits of the children who had vanished. They were trapped, unable to move on, their cries for help echoing through the camp. I knew I had to do something. I contacted the authorities, and an investigation was launched. The camp was closed down, and the area was searched thoroughly. They found nothing concrete, but the camp remained closed, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had occurred. To this day, Elmwood Camp remains abandoned, a place where the whispers of lost children can still be heard on quiet nights. Whenever I drive past the old camp, I can't help but feel a chill. I know the voices are still there, trapped in the woods, waiting for someone to hear their cries and set them free. It was a cold December evening in New York City, and I had just finished a late shift at the office. The streets were buzzing with holiday shoppers, their faces illuminated by the colorful lights strung across every storefront. I was exhausted, my body aching from the long day, and all I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and crawl into bed. As I stepped out of my office building, I hailed the first taxi I saw. It screeched to a halt beside me, and I hurriedly climbed into the back seat. The driver was an older man, with deep-set eyes and a scruffy beard, wearing a worn-out cap that cast a shadow over his face. He didn't say a word as I told him my address. He just nodded and started driving. The moment the taxi pulled away from the curb, a strange sense of unease settled over me. The city outside the windows seemed to blur, the familiar landmarks fading into the night as the taxi sped through the streets. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the ride felt off, like we were moving through a different world altogether. The interior of the taxi was dimly lit, and the smell of stale cigarette smoke clung to the worn upholstery. The driver's eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror occasionally, but he never spoke. The silence in the cab was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the distant honking of horns outside. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, convincing myself that it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as the minutes ticked by, the cityscape outside grew increasingly unfamiliar. The tall buildings gave way to narrow, winding streets that I didn't recognize, and the bright lights of the city faded into darkness. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the street signs, but they were too blurred to read. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Are we going the right way? This doesn't look like the route to my place." The driver didn't respond, didn't even glance in my direction. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a knot of fear tightening in my chest. I reached for my phone to check the GPS, but when I looked at the screen, the map was blank, as if we had driven off the edge of the world. Panic set in, and I leaned forward again, more insistent this time. "Hey, where are you taking me? Stop the car." The driver still didn't respond, but his eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror again, and this time I caught a glimpse of something strange in his reflection. His eyes weren't just deep-set, they were hollow, empty, like a dark void staring back at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks were engaged, and the windows wouldn't roll down. I was trapped in the back seat of this taxi with a driver who wasn't entirely human, driving through a part of the city that didn't seem to exist. The fear that had been gnawing at me since the ride began turned into full-blown terror. I pounded on the partition between the front and back seats, shouting for the driver to stop. But he just kept driving, his expressionless face a mask of indifference. The taxi picked up speed, the world outside the windows a blur of shadows and distorted shapes. I could feel the car tilting, like we were going downhill, but there were no hills in the part of the city I lived in. The streets seemed to twist and warp, leading us deeper into a dark, unfamiliar landscape. I could hear the faint sound of whispers, like the voices of the lost and the damned, growing louder with each passing second. I glanced out the window again, but the city was gone, replaced by a vast expanse of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. There were no street lights, no buildings, nothing but an endless void. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to warn me, or maybe lure me further into the darkness. I turned my attention back to the driver, my voice trembling with fear. "Please, let me out. I just want to go home." The driver's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was a low, raspy whisper, like the sound of dead leaves rustling in the wind. "There is no going home," he said, his words sending a chill through my entire body. "Not from here." The taxi lurched forward, and I was thrown back against the seat. The world outside was spinning now, the darkness swirling like a vortex, pulling us deeper into its depths. I closed my eyes, gripping the seat with both hands, praying that this was all just a nightmare, that I would wake up in my bed at any moment. But when I opened my eyes again, the darkness had changed. We were no longer driving through the void. Instead, we were on a narrow, winding road that seemed to cut through a dense forest. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the air was thick with fog. The whispers were still there, but they had become more distinct, more human. I could hear voices now, voices filled with despair, begging for help, crying out in pain. The road ahead was barely visible through the fog, but the taxi kept moving, its headlights cutting through the mist. I could see shadows moving among the trees, figures that seemed to materialize out of the darkness, only to disappear again when the headlights passed over them. The driver's face was a mask of calm, as if he had done this 1,000 times before, as if he was leading me to my doom. I knew I had to get out of the taxi, but the doors were still locked, the windows sealed shut. I tried to think of a way to escape, but my mind was clouded with fear, my thoughts racing too fast to form a coherent plan. The road began to narrow, the trees closing in on either side, their branches scraping against the sides of the taxi. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, as if the voices were trying to tell me something important, something I needed to know to survive. And then, without warning, the taxi came to a sudden stop. The driver turned to face me, his hollow eyes boring into mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. "This is your stop," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The locks clicked open, and the door beside me swung outward on its own. I hesitated, my heart racing, unsure of what to do. But the driver just stared at me, his expression unreadable, waiting for me to make my move. I knew I couldn't stay in the taxi. Whatever was out there, and the fog-shrouded forest, was better than the unknown fate that awaited me if I stayed. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The moment my feet hit the ground, the door slammed shut behind me, and the taxi sped off into the fog, disappearing from sight. I was alone now, standing on the edge of the forest, the road behind me fading into the mist. The whispers were louder than ever, filling the air around me, and I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I had no idea where I was or how I had gotten there, but I knew I had to keep moving. The road ahead was barely visible through the fog, but it was the only path I could see. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence, the whispers following me with every step. The trees loomed over me, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The fog was thick, swirling around me like a living thing, and I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to lead me somewhere, trying to guide me through the darkness. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my mind numb with fear. The road seemed endless, winding through the forest with no end in sight. The whispers never ceased, their voices filling my head, driving me to the brink of madness. And then, just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I saw it, a light in the distance, faint and flickering, but unmistakable. I quickened my pace, desperate to reach the light, to find some semblance of civilization in this nightmare. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, and I could make out the shape of a small, dilapidated cabin nestled among the trees. The windows were broken, the walls covered in ivy, but the light inside was warm and inviting. I approached the cabin cautiously, the whispers still echoing in my ears, warning me to stay away. But I was too tired, too scared to listen. I needed shelter, a place to rest, and this was the only option. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The cabin was small and cramped, with a single room that served as both the kitchen and living area. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and a worn-out armchair sat in front of it, facing the flames. The whispers were gone now, replaced by the comforting crackle of the fire. I closed the door behind me and sank into the armchair, my body finally relaxing for the first time since I had gotten into that cursed taxi. But as I sat there, staring into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was something in the cabin with me, something I couldn't see, but could feel watching me. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room, but there was nothing there, just the flickering shadows on the walls. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, its face hidden in shadow, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. My heart raced, my breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure stepped forward, and I could see its face now, twisted and deformed, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. It was the driver of the taxi, his hollow eyes fixed on mine, a sinister smile curling his lips. "You didn't think you could escape, did you?" he whispered, his voice low and menacing. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen in place, trapped in the armchair as the driver advanced on me, his eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. "This is your stop," he said again, and I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy, pulling me back into the darkness. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth, the light of the flames fading into the shadows, and the whispers starting up again, louder than ever, filling my head with their maddening chorus. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road, the morning sun shining down on me, the forest gone, the fog lifted. The city was back, the familiar sounds of traffic and people bustling about, filling the air. I was back in the real world, but I knew that what I had experienced wasn't a dream. The taxi, the forest, the cabin, they were all real, and the driver was still out there, waiting for his next passenger. I never took a taxi again after that night, and every time I see one drive by, I feel a shiver run down my spine, a reminder of the ride that nearly took me to the other side. The whispers still haunt me, a constant reminder that the darkness is never far away, that it's always waiting just around the corner, ready to take you on a ride you'll never forget. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, an opportunity to explore the abandoned amusement park that had been closed for years. I had always been fascinated by such places, the decaying rides, the echoes of laughter from a bygone era, the stories that seemed to linger in the shadows. So when a friend suggested we visit the old park, I eagerly agreed. Little did I know this trip would turn into a nightmarish ordeal. The park was located on the outskirts of town, a sprawling complex of rusting rides and derelict buildings. It had been closed down after a series of accidents that left several people dead. The official story was that it was deemed unsafe, but rumors circulated about the true reasons for its closure. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it was cursed. I was skeptical, but the allure of the unknown was too strong. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the park's dilapidated attractions. The entrance gate was chained and locked, but we managed to find a way through a hole in the fence. The sight before us was both fascinating and unsettling. The once vibrant colors of the rides were now faded and peeling, and the air was thick with the smell of rust and mildew. As we wandered through the park, we marveled at the eerie stillness. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its cabin swaying slightly in the breeze. The carousel stood silent, its horses frozen in mid-gallop. We explored the old funhouse, its mirrors cracked and distorted, creating unsettling reflections. As night fell, the atmosphere grew more ominous. The park's darkness seemed to take on a life of its own, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing. We decided to set up a small campfire near the old ticket booth, hoping to ward off the chill and add a sense of normalcy to the unsettling surroundings. Around midnight, we began to hear strange noises. At first, it was just the creaking of the rides, but then there were footsteps, faint but unmistakable. We joked about the park being haunted, trying to lighten the mood, but the laughter quickly faded when the noises grew louder and more distinct. Suddenly, the carousel started to turn on its own, the music playing faintly through the night. The melody was haunting and distorted, sending chills down our spines. We watched in disbelief as the horses moved slowly, their eyes seemingly following us. I tried to rationalize it as a malfunction, but deep down I knew something was wrong. One of my friends, Dave, suggested we investigate the source of the noises. We reluctantly agreed, grabbing flashlights and cautiously making our way through the park. The footsteps seemed to follow us, echoing in the empty spaces. The park felt alive with an unseen presence, and every creak and rustle heightened our anxiety. We approached the old roller coaster, its once thrilling loops now rusted and decrepit. The sounds were louder here, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from beneath the ground. We searched for a way to access the area below the coaster, hoping to find an explanation for the noises. As we pried open a rusty maintenance hatch, a foul smell emanated from the darkness below. We hesitated, but decided to descend. The stairs creaked ominously, and the air grew colder as we reached the bottom. The thumping grew louder, a steady, almost heartbeat-like rhythm dot in the dim light of our flashlights. We saw something that defied explanation. There, among the rusted machinery and debris, was an old, decrepit ticket booth, its sign barely readable. But what caught our attention was the figure standing behind the counter, a shadowy, indistinct shape that seemed to move and writhe in the darkness. We froze, unable to tear our eyes away. The figure seemed to be watching us, its presence suffocating. The thumping grew louder, more frantic, and the temperature dropped sharply. Panic set in, and we scrambled to leave, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. As we emerged from the maintenance area, we saw that the park had changed. The once familiar sights were now distorted and menacing. The carousel spun faster, its music growing louder and more discordant. The Ferris wheel creaked ominously, its cabin swaying violently. We made our way back to the entrance, but the fence was now impossible to breach. It felt as though the park had trapped us within its grounds. The shadowy figure seemed to follow us, its presence felt rather than seen. Our attempts to call for help were met with silence. Our phones had no signal, and the park seemed to be enveloped in a thick, oppressive fog. Desperation set in as we tried to find another way out. We stumbled through the park, the noises and shadows growing more intense. The whispers of the past seemed to surround us, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of anguish and despair. Just when we thought we were trapped forever, we spotted a glimmer of light through the fog. It led us to an old service road that we had missed earlier. We followed it, our hearts racing, until we finally reached the edge of the park. The light of the outside world was a welcome sight. We didn't stop until we were safely away from the park, our breaths ragged and our nerves frayed. We looked back, but the park was shrouded in darkness, its secrets hidden once more. We vowed never to return, and as far as I know, none of us ever did. To this day, the abandoned amusement park remains a dark and unsettling memory. The sounds, the figures, and the feeling of being watched continue to haunt me. Sometimes, when I hear a distant carnival tune or see a flickering light, I can't help but remember the park and the sinister forces that lurk within its rusting attractions.